Hey everybody, congrats on getting those midterms submitted and getting halfway through this course. Now we're really diving into the dimension of this course where before we were focusing on, what are the structures and foundations that we need to understand? What is our starting point when it comes to US governance, this system and society that we take for granted at times. Now we're diving into contemporary institutions and really the means in which we as citizens have to engage with our government. And one of the most important and foundational elements of public engagement is the electoral process. So this week we're diving into elections and campaigns, building off of what we covered last week in political parties. So let's get going. So learning objectives for the day, we have to understand a couple terms and just general systems of electoral structures. So we have to understand what a winner takes all system indicates, what first past the post is, and what a counter opportunity is in ranked choice voting, a system that is being implemented in the United States in numerous states. We even saw a ballot referendum in the state of Montana that did not pass in recent years. So we will look at those general structures, what they are, where they are in effect, as all three of those are represented in some United States collectives. And we also want to explore four ways in which our Constitution addresses how we vote, just like we've done with a lot of our previous lectures. They won't be a primary objective of the lecture necessarily, but it's important to understand what our Constitution says, what our starting point is regarding our guiding document, also our restricting document. We're also going to look at a distinction between soft and hard money in politics. I'm going to have my cat attack me. For some reason, I can't even swim. Whoa, she's even yelling now. Cat's being mean today. Not her day. Say goodbye, Mo, even though she'll probably be back very soon. She, yeah. All right, so we're also going to make a distinction between two different primary processes and understanding what the primary process really is. So let's get going. All right, what does our Constitution say on the electoral process? It's very important to do a little bit of review. Remember what our 12th Amendment designates regarding our presidential elections and vice presidential elections, as well as what we will do in cases of ties, as we have the House of Representatives designate who the president will be if there's a tie in the Electoral College, and the Senate if there's a tie within the vice presidency, although that has never occurred. So did not dive into that in much detail. And we know that this is when we decided that we will vote for the president and vice president on distinctly different ballots instead of having the runner-up become the vice president. So we also build off of that to understand the 14th Amendment, an amendment we will be diving into in excruciating detail in addition to the 15th Amendment, but in the next few weeks, especially when we cover civil rights and civil liberties. We also remember briefly that in the last lecture, when we covered the judicial branch, the 14th Amendment was foundational in providing a lot of the rulings by our Supreme Court in recent years, but most in particular those landmark rulings that we examined, the majority of them being grounded off of the 14th Amendment's interpretation. We also know the 15th Amendment. This required later additional legislation to truly expand the voting rights for all males, regardless of race in this nation. We also see the 19th Amendment down there, two below, that also finally included women's voting rights and women's suffrage in the 1920s to also encompass this right to that collective. Sorry, my cat is attacking me so much for some reason, and it's not worth re-recording. I'm just going to keep pushing her away. So we also know the 17th Amendment expanded the democratic processes within the United States, expanding our our role in national senator elections, as previously that was determined by state level legislatures. Hello, Mo. You're going to tell them about the Constitution and elections? Here we go. We're going to let you go. So we also know the 22nd Amendment limited presidents to 2 terms, as we've covered in previous elections. You're noticing a trend here. A lot of this we've already covered. We'll bounce back into a lot of these constitutional amendments throughout the entire of this course, as they do relate to a lot of the most foundational elements of United States governance. So 23rd Amendment granted DC electors in the Electoral College, expanding the Electoral College to not just be a simple mathematical equation of senators plus House representatives, but now senators plus House representatives plus 3 for DC. And then we know the 24th Amendment provided greater protections for voting rights as it banned poll taxes in national elections, really removing those barriers to entry when it comes to casting your vote in the United States, predominantly in those southern eastern states. In the 26th Amendment, 27 being the final and most recent amendment, so 26, we see that we made the legal voting age 28, the legal voting age 18 instead of 21. This was a large part in response to mass protests at the time revolving around the Vietnam War, as there were sentiments focusing on if we can go and die for this country, we should be able to vote for this country. So you see a immediate electoral responsiveness to the mass population via the 26th Amendment. So these are a lot of the foundational amendments guiding the electoral process. It's worth noting the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th Amendments all came within the same decade. We will be looking at that era later on, probably one of our last lectures, don't remember the exact week, as we explain how change occurs in the United States. And we'll examine that decade as one of the most pivotal periods of constitutional reform that we've seen in U.S. history, beyond right after the Reconstruction era amendments and, of course, the original origin days as we crafted our Bill of Rights. So a little bit of foundation there as to what our Constitution says, as there's a lot of guidance regarding the electoral process on numerous bodies within our federal government. Mo, my girl, Mo, please leave. Do you hear that? This cat's just attacking me. So, the election of 1824. Oh my, sorry about this cat. This is where we see, and I pardon me for forgetting if I covered this in this class or just in the in-person section, but it's very important to revisit, as it is an example of our 12th Amendment in action. In this election, we had 6 Democratic Republican candidates, and they were the only candidates. We had no partisan opposition to the majority party in power. So we see this is a time of a one-party governance in the United States, a brief period that revealed some of the need for a institutionalized and strong structured secondary opposition party to the party in government. But when we look at this election, a brief revisitation of history, out of these 6 individuals that ran for office, we have Smith Thompson, who was the Secretary of the Navy and withdrew relatively early, so we can just kind of forget his name in the grand scheme of history at the moment. John Calhoun, a name you might have heard here and there, that does pop up notably at this time period as he had significant influence in the national governing structures. He also withdrew his name from the election relatively early, but did eventually win the vice presidency due to this removal for the presidency early on and beginning of campaigning for the vice presidency. So John Calhoun, the winner of the vice presidency in 1824. Now, and that was because he had the majority of the electoral college votes. Very important distinction to make. Now's where we enter into the real candidates, the candidates that stayed in the race up until the very end and obtained some electoral college votes. So we have William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, who obtained 41 electoral college votes. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, a position we covered briefly, well, not too briefly, we covered in depth a few weeks in the past. As we remember, the contemporary Speaker of the House has extensive influence, and we will see again through another example the influence of the Speaker of the House via the actions of Henry Clay in the following months. So Henry Clay obtained 37 electoral college votes, the Speaker of the House, although he was not, neither of these individuals obtained enough electoral college votes or popular support to really have a chance in the electoral college and having a chance in the general election. So that's where we get to the final 2 candidates. The 2 candidates that you may remember by name and have the most impact following this election. So that would be John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who was at the time the Secretary of State, and who in this election was able to obtain 84 electoral college votes and 30.9% of the popular vote. Now this is in contrast to Andrew Jackson, who was able to obtain more electoral college votes and a larger percentage of the popular vote than John Quincy Adams, but not a majority, not to the point where he had a plurality, not a majority. He did not have the majority of all electoral college votes cast. You know how in today's elections, we have to hit that magic number of 270. You don't simply have to have more than your opponent. You have to have at least 270, the majority of total electoral college votes distributed. So we see no candidate obtained the majority of total electoral college votes distributed, as Andrew Jackson only obtained 99 electoral college votes and 41.4% of the popular vote. Both metrics at a higher rate than John Quincy Adams, but did not reach that majority threshold. And according to the 12th Amendment, not only when there is a tie in the Electoral College, but when there is no clear winner of the Electoral College. The House of Representatives will determine the winner of the election. And in this election, who was the Speaker of the House, the individual with arguably the most influence and sway in the electoral body of the House of Representatives? That would be Henry Clay, one of the candidates in this election. Now, I also want to make sure I mention a point that I didn't adequately address to begin with. This is a general election that is looking mostly like a primary. The candidates are campaigning off of personality differences. They generally align in party sentiments and policy advocacy. So this is a lot like what you see in, electoral primary, party primaries of the past few years regarding the presidency, and when we have, a handful of candidates focusing on their unique personality over necessarily the general election that we have today, where you see a focus on policy proposals. So that I wanted to make that point made clearly about the general election of 1824. It operated similarly to a primary. So out of all these candidates, we remember Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, and we have those two top vote getters, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Hi, Mo. And the Speaker of the House will be tasked with mobilizing the body to cast a vote for who will be the next President of the United States. Well, a neat little point in history. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, did not like Andrew Jackson. He viewed Andrew Jackson as kind of a outside of government, radical in many senses. He was more of a wartime general than a statesman, as one would say at the time. Did not have a depth in policymaking, but did have a great experience in wartime activities. So Henry Clay viewed this individual's presidency as a threat to United States governance and our ability to engage with each other diplomatically. So Henry Clay became advocating behind the scenes against the candidate who obtained the most electoral college votes and the most popular support. Well, in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House does have notable sway and influence, and Henry Clay was successful in his campaign against Andrew Jackson. And the final vote coming out of the House of Representatives was a vote with the majority calling for the new president to be a president who did not obtain the majority of the Electoral College votes, who did not obtain the majority of the popular support. The new president, by vote of the House of Representatives, via the constitutional legitimacy provided by the 12th Amendment, will be John Quincy Adams. And we see this is another example. This is a clear example of how there are numerous elections in U.S. history where we have had the winner of the presidency not have majority popular support, but also not even be elected via the Electoral College, but instead by House vote. So a unique example. We have never had a comparable election in U.S. history. The closest we have ever come was not an election that was decided by our House of Representatives, but was an election in 2000 that we will explore later on, but was determined by our Supreme Court along notably different lines. But it's the only other election where we can consider another body outside of the Electoral College determining who the winner of the election would be. A unique moment in U.S. history, revealing the action of the 12th Amendment as we see it in effect in the year 1824. So we're covering this term over and over again, but I think I need to make one clear distinction. As I mentioned it in the last slide, the difference between a plurality and a majority. We know pluralism is a simple theory that views governance as a condition or systems in which two or more states, groups, the sources of authority, principles, whatever it be, coexist in a single society. Now, when we have a pluralist system, you often determine leadership by electoral processes, trying to determine who the majority will be and advocate for those minority protections simultaneously. But when you do this, you have to determine who that majority is first. And there are two distinct ways of determining the majority when you have single-member districts, like we do in the United States. Single-member districts, that is a geographical area in which that area is appointing one individual to govern within a certain body. So we see when we talk about those elections in single-member districts, and we'll go into that single-member district term again briefly, but it's important to know that there are two ways to determine who wins an election. You can have the plurality or the majority. The plurality, a plurality voting system, simply understood as the candidate with the most votes wins. All you have to do is get more votes than the people you're running against. Say there are 5 people running for office. All you have to do is get over 20%, as if everybody else distributes adequately. So you could win an entire election with only 22% of the general population support under certain circumstances. So that is a plurality system. A majority rule system would not allow for an individual to win an election unless they have the majority of all voting citizens. Think of that as like those runoff elections that come up here and there during election cycles. And we do see in the past few years, we've seen a notable runoff election in the state of Georgia. But we've also seen numerous runoff elections in many primaries of most recent elections. And what is a runoff election? Well, there are two candidates that obtained like 48 and then 49% of the popular vote, but nobody got over 50%. Even though one candidate got the plurality of voting, they had more votes than their opposition, they do not have the clear majority and do not win the body. So it is an important distinction to make when we talk about plurality needs and majority needs. Do you simply need to get the majority or the plurality of votes? And you tie this into Duverger's law, which we've covered in past lectures. It helps you understand how we have the two-party system that we have today, as we oftentimes only have plurality rule elections. So we will explore that later on in more detail. So electoral candidates, some key terms that are worth noting and a general understanding provided by one of our greatest political scientists and political theorists, David Mayhew. So let's start off with some key terms. What does it mean to be an incumbent? An incumbent is an individual who previously held the office they are running for election for. It is a candidate who is running for re-election, not election. So you see incumbents historically have had a measurable benefit, oftentimes due to name recognition and the ability to reveal actions and impacts of their policies through their past term. So incumbent is oftentimes referred to as the incumbent benefit in an electoral process. If we have a candidate who runs for their second term as the president, they are the incumbent candidate and oftentimes have benefits over the other. In contemporary political climates, we've seen discussions and some beginnings of examinations of the incumbent deficit. That it might be a harm at sometimes to be the incumbent candidate, considering various economic general themes, and you could also consider national security threats as well, determining whether that will be a benefit or a detriment. But we know historically the incumbent has always had a benefit in the electoral process. So when we talk about debates in presidential elections, it's very important to make a distinction in the origins of these debates. For one, we have not always had presidential debates as we've seen in recent years. We saw the first presidential debate stemming from the Lincoln-Douglas debates with our boy Abe Lincoln, as they were a foundational model for contemporary debates, as we saw the two engaging in public expressions of policy advocation. They are debating the simple dynamics of the election and their unique qualifications for the office. But we also see that over time, this first original Lincoln-Douglas debate, LD, if you're in the high school debate world, about what the world ought to be, we see this has developed over time. We see the 1960s Kennedy versus Nixon debates, where we had the first televised presidential debates. We even had a period, after the Kennedy-Nixon debates where there was not quite notable national televising of presidential debates, but we do see this picked up quite notably in recent years. And we see the 1990s election in which we saw Ross Perot and the Reform Party gain notable traction. We saw for the first and only time in U.S. history a third-party candidate on the national debate stage on the run-up debate to the election. So we see the development of the debate processes. One of the main means in which we have to understand who these candidates are is one that is developed in recent years. Now, when we look at that, a famous work in political science, if you go to graduate school, you will have to read this in your American government graduate course. And I thought, if you have to read it on the graduate level, it's at least worth briefly mentioning on the undergraduate level. So what is the electoral connection? It's a work written by David Mayhew in 1970s, I want to say 73 or 76, one of those two dates, where he examined the incentives guiding elected officials while they are governing in office. So he was working, I forget the exact role he was in, but he was working for some representatives within Congress. And while he was working there, he began taking notes and examining what their actions were and what guided those actions while in office. And he identified that there are three things that will guide every single elected representative's actions while in office. And there will be one motive driving all three of these activities. And that motive will be re-election. And they will engage in advertising, establishing familiarity with their name. This is where that incumbent benefit really comes in. The current incumbent has a significant benefit when it comes to name familiarity. So advertising is a frequent activity of those who have already gained office who are interested in re-election. We also see credit taking, identifying responsibility for positively viewed policies. You could say, unemployment is down. You're welcome. That's an example of credit taking that you've seen many elected candidates engaging in, oftentimes with the primary focus of re-election, identifying what you've done right so you can continue to do right in the future. And then we see position taking, publicly identifying yourself or the candidate on one clear side of a policy divide. Oftentimes, sometimes even lacking policy advocacy, but more so advocacy for a general position. We see this especially during electoral years, electoral sessions, and it has notable influence in the public perceptions of what one candidate may do regarding a certain issue once they obtain office, or if they were able to continue their work in office. So we thank the Electoral Connection and David Mayhew's analysis of our elected representatives for providing a better insight into how and why our elected representatives act the way they do on a daily basis while representing the needs of us, the citizens. So let's dive into some of these electoral systems. It is very important to understand a key term, first past the post. This is simply viewed as the plurality rule. Remember, we talked about plurality and majority. Plurality, you just have to beat your opponents. Majority, you have to beat the system at large. You have to get the majority of candidates, and it's almost in the name itself. You see that visualization over there. The plurality would be the green would be the winner of this election, although they probably only obtained about 48% of the vote. The majority would be a scenario where you have to obtain 50%. As you see, green obtained that 50% and would be the winner of that election. So a first past the post election is a system that helps us understand how we will determine who the winner of the election is. That's a very important detail to make. This is how we determine who wins. And if you obtain more votes than your opponents, you win the election. This is a large part enabled due to single member districts. Again, a single member district is a geographical area that is geographically defined in which a population has the ability to appoint a single member to represent their geographical domain. Oftentimes, if they have a first past the post system, you do not need to have the majority of that population supporting your policies or your position in government to win the position. You just need to have more votes than your opponents in the election. So oversimplify this. How we determine who the winner is. This is not present in every single district in the United States. We see numerous districts and some states that do not use this system. We see in Maine and Alaska, they've implemented systems that are some level of ranked choice voting, although it varies in each state and the way it is implemented. So we see this varies from state to state and district to district. But first past the post determines who the winner of the election is, the individual who has the simple plurality. Now, how does this compare to a winner takes all system? Well, it's not really standing in contrast. While first past the post determines how we determine who the winner is, winner takes all kind of indicates what we're going to do once we know who the winner is. A winner takes all is when whoever wins the election, they will then get 100% of the state's electoral college votes. Apparently, win that regional election. So this is a scenario where we do not require simple majorities, but we do grant the winner of the election via plurality. If it is a first past the post system, these electoral systems can coexist. Then we would grant them all of the electoral college votes. So let's go through an example. Say we're looking at the state of Montana. The state of Montana has a winner takes all system. I believe we have 4 electoral college votes. We got a new one from California in 2020. So with a winner takes all system in which we have 4 electoral college votes to distribute to presidential candidates, what if we have a general election in which, like our last election, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are running against each other. Well, Donald Trump obtained, let's say it's Montana, RFK Jr. was still on the ballot in Montana. Well, let's say a large percentage, because we know we got those true libertarians in this state, a large percentage of individuals voted for RFK Jr., and we also see maybe a large percentage of voters voted for a Green Party candidate pulling out from the Democratic collectives. So we could see an election where Donald Trump may have 40% of the popular vote. These are all random numbers off the top of my head. Kamala Harris has 30% of the popular vote. We would grant Donald Trump with the plurality of voting due to first past the post also being a system present in this state. We would make him the winner of the election. And now that we know that he won the election because first past the post, we'll implement winner takes all and give Donald Trump all 4 of the state's electoral college votes. We see that this is in effect in the vast majority of states, 48 out of 50, excluding Maine and Nebraska, as they distribute their electoral college votes based on the percentage of the vote that those candidates obtained, and it varies between these 2 states. But you can see in Nebraska, a Democratic candidate gets 2 electoral college votes, while the Republican candidate may get 3, or Democratic candidate gets 1, Republican gets 3, and we even give electoral college votes to that Libertarian candidate. We can see this enables the more accurate distribution of electoral college votes and having them better represent the general population's voting numbers. So we see winner takes all determines how we will allocate the electoral college votes after we have already determined who the winner is via first past the post or ranked choice voting, as we will cover right now. So what is a ranked choice voting system? It is an electoral system in which voters rank candidates by preference on their ballots. This is a system where you would say rank 5 different candidates in preference. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 being your least favorite candidate, 1 being your favorite candidate. And say we have all 5 candidates running in this election, but nobody obtained 50%. Well, in a ranked choice voting system, a traditional ranked choice voting system, although you can have variations in these systems, of course, throughout each of their states and districts, this ranked choice voting system would say, well, since nobody obtained a clear majority, nobody obtained 50%, let's disqualify those 2 lowest vote getters, say, and let's distribute their second tier votes. So if you as a voter voted for, I don't know, Jimmy John as your primary candidate because he's your neighbor and he's your best friend, he represents you perfectly, but nobody else likes him, he doesn't really have a chance, and he loses that election in that first round of disqualifying candidates. Well, you still have a vote as a citizen of this district. Your first vote might not have won the election, but because you ranked your candidates, your second tiered preference will then go into effect. If you voted for, say, I don't even want to give an example, but another candidate, and many individuals made that candidate their second tier vote that were in the that voted for those disqualified candidates as their first vote, then you can possibly see another candidate in the second round of voting, due to the reallocation of certain citizens' votes, obtain 50% and win the election. We would have a process of elimination, eliminating lowest vote getters and distributing their votes, the citizens who voted for them, their lower tiered votes, to those who are still in the race. So we see that system, and it is the way we will determine who the winner of a certain election is. This increases the likelihood of moderate representatives, according to data, as it encourages those to appeal to those middle ideological bases. It also opens up the doors for third-party candidates in regions like Montana, so to speak, where you have a large sentiment among the population that doesn't directly align with either Democrat or Republican, but may align with, say, a libertarian collective. So we see ranked choice voting has 2 main benefits, according to political scientists. That is to increase the likelihood of moderation among candidates and open up for third-party candidates. We do want to make sure that we remember that this is a system that requires a majority vote, and it does this through a process of elimination in which individual citizens tier their votes in order of preference. We see this as in effect in some states like Maine and Alaska, and many local governments and states have been considering implementation of ranked choice voting. So for all I know, since I made this slide last semester, we could have more states that have versions of ranked choice voting. And I think it is actually most likely that that is the case. So we talked about these three systems. They all exist in some level within the United States, but it's very important to acknowledge that there are other options. And there's one that stands out to many individuals, and you might want to write some of your term paper about this electoral system. That would be an electoral system called proportional representation. This is where political parties will gain seats in proportion to the number of votes they receive. There is a wide range of avenues in which you could have a proportional representation system and those elections. You can have open list, closed list parties where you would vote for party candidates and your political party, or you could have scenarios where you don't vote for party candidates, but you vote for your political party, and whatever percentage of votes your party obtains in the election, party officials will then distribute candidates accordingly. So that's a complex way of examining it. If you're interested in writing your paper on this, we can explore open list and closed list party systems. But the primary takeaway is a proportional system is a system in which we distribute votes based on what percentage of the population voted for those candidates. Say 5% of the population voted for a Green Party candidate. Then within our national Congress, so if this was what we were electing, voting for, we would then give them 5% of the governing seats. This system is present in numerous states abroad. Germany, Netherlands, the list, New Zealand, South Africa, Israel, Brazil, Sweden, so many more. Those are just some of the off of the head top examples. So proportional representation has gained notable traction internationally and predominantly in Europe as well, as we see many early political scientists pointing to electoral systems in Europe as another option for how we can elect candidates. Now, proportional representation is not present in the United States. We do not have open list, closed list party systems or any level of proportional representation. We have first past the post and winner takes all alongside ranked choice voting systems, which in some circumstances aim to present an electoral body that is proportional to the population, although we do not have a clear proportional system. So let's talk about the primary process. We've kind of overlooked a lot of these primary processes throughout this lecture so far, so let's dive back in. So when we talk about primaries, it's very important to know who is in charge of governing the primary process and regulating their internal primaries. And that would be the political parties themselves. This is why when we look at civil rights and civil liberties in the throughout U.S. history, we see a avenue in which political parties were the battleground for the restriction of voting rights for many individuals. As we saw the grandfather clause, white primaries, it's in the name, implemented to restrict many individuals from reaching the polls. We'll explore those when we cover civil liberties and civil rights in a later lecture. But to talk about primary process at large, I think it's important to note a distinction between a closed primary and an open primary. So a closed primary is when only declared party members can vote in the primary election. It requires a declaration of party prior to the primary. So you declare your party, and then you would receive a primary ballot, and you can vote for, all the different candidates within the primary party. And if you're a little confused, remember, primaries, the election within parties that happen before the general election, where we have elections between parties. This is within parties. This is where you would see, look at 2016, the Republican primary had a large number of candidates. You got the Jeb Bush, Ted Cruz, I think even Marco Rubio, Ben Carson was in there. Donald Trump won the primary. He became the Republican candidate, ran for president. You know that history. Just wanted to make sure we all understand that key point. So when we have a political primary, you can either have an open or a closed primary, although it is also worth noting we have many states with semi-closed primaries. Now, if you are in a closed primary state, you declare that you are a Republican so you can vote in the Republican primary. But maybe something happened, and from the time you voted in the primary to the time of the general election, you might have started liking that Democratic candidate or flip the names, whatever it may be. I'm just names off the top of my head. And you are in no way restricted from voting for the opposing party candidate in the general election if you are in a closed primary system. This is exclusive to the primary process. So, in the primary process where you vote internally within each party. Closed primary, you can only obtain the ballot for the party you declared for. An open primary is one where people can vote in the primary election regardless of their party identification. You do not have to declare your political party, but it is important to note you can only vote in one primary election. This is done so that individuals aren't incentivized to vote strategically in other primaries. Think of going back to that Republican and Democratic primary process. You could, if you were a hardline Democrat, so to speak, and you saw that the Democratic candidate was already determined, but there's opportunity for a couple different directions within the Republican Party, you could strategically, theoretically, vote for the worst candidate within that primary to increase your favored candidates, favored parties' odds in the general election. So we make it to where you can only vote in one political primary that you either declare or do not declare. You have open primary systems where you may be sent multiple ballots and you have the opportunity to send one of those ballots back. Those ballots will be for each political party, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green Party, whatever it may be. So we see that the state of Montana has a system in which we are distributed numerous primary ballots, and we have the right and ability to send back one of those primary ballots and vote for one party primary. We do know that many states have semi-closed primaries, which we will not be diving into as it varies between states, but it is worth noting 21 states have an open primary system, 14 states have a closed primary system, and 15 states have a semi-closed primary system. It's, where you can really, and we'll save that for a later day. But if you have interest in understanding what a semi-closed primary system or the specifics of the Montana state primary system, please reach out. I'm happy to explain. But we know the primary system as our ability to go to the polls or have a ballot sent to our home and then vote at our convenience in those times. Oftentimes highly distributed among many voting polls and within many households. This is in contrast to a caucus, which is similar to primaries except voting would happen in one place at one specific time. This is, if you visualize it, think of the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, or the state conventions that happen during election years. Well, a caucus would be where only those who are in attendance have the ability to vote in that primary. 1970s, where we see the traditional contemporary political party process really gaining traction and being relied on in the United States, where previously we saw a large extent caucus procedures occurring previously. So we think the shift in the 1970s also coming with that decade of electoral constitutional reform, resulting in a primary process that we know today in contrast to a more closed off, exclusive caucus process. Now, when we talk about elections, you can't talk about elections without considering the role of money, especially post 2010 in the ruling provided by Citizens United, as we covered in the past lectures, that increased the extent of money in politics at notable rates. So, what is the difference between soft and hard money in politics? Understood simply, hard money are funds contributed directly to candidates by individuals or political action committees. So this is money that, say you like the candidate who's running in your local district, you give them $60. That's great. You can contribute to politics. Money is speech in many instances, especially according to Supreme Court. But when we look at those instances, hard money is often heavily regulated. You as an individual can only contribute to a certain individual's campaign up to a certain amount. I know in the state of Montana, if you run for a state house seat, you can only obtain, I'm off the top of my head, I believe it was roughly $400 from any single individual. So you could not obtain the mass majority of your campaign funds through one person, one very wealthy and ideological person. And instead, and that's regarding hard money. So hard money is highly regulated in how much individuals can contribute to campaigns. But once an individual contributes it to the campaign has, of course, ethical, regulations, but they have the freedom to spend it as they deem fit. In contrast, we can see soft money. Soft money is what we've seen a rapid increase in recent years, especially following Citizens United. These are funds contributed to state, local, or national parties or political action committees for the purpose of running state elections or conducting local grassroots political activities. So, simply put, soft money has gone through institutions while hard money has gone from individual to campaign. So that's the bullet point right there. So we know soft money has increased in its influence in recent years, and a thing that's worth noting, soft money goes through less regulations when it comes to collecting those funds. You can collect more funds from individuals or corporations or general entities without as much regulation as you see with hard money. But once those funds are collected, there is greater regulation in how those institutions, state, local parties, political action committees, how they then spend those funds. So we see a distinction in hard and soft money being how they were granted to campaigns or committees and collectives, and how they are regulated as well. The regulation we will explore later on, but it's important to make the general overarching distinction between the two. So when we talk about how we regulate campaign finance, just a brief discussion throughout our history, we have to dive back to, well, we could go back further than this, but for the sake of today's lectures, we're going to dive back into 1971 with the Federal Election Campaign Act. This act strengthened disclosure rules, increased spending limits, really created a lot of those regulations that we think about when it comes to hard money spending in politics. It created the FEC, Federal Election Commission, and added public funding for presidential nominees. So it tried to regulate the extent of high finance in politics and provided more transparency for the electoral process. Of course, stemming from the 1970s time period where there was a strong public advocacy for greater transparency and accountability within the national government. One of the means to do so was the Federal Election Campaign Act, which provided more transparency. We see later interpretations provided by our Supreme Court in Buckley v. Vallejo, the 1976 ruling, where we determined that money spent in politics is a form of free speech, laying the foundational roadmap for a later ruling in Citizens United, which we have covered in the past. And what Buckley v. Vallejo did, it brought the rise of political action committees. Remember, Citizens United created super political action committees, while Buckley v. Vallejo created the foundational roadmap for soft money in national politics. This allowed wealthy candidates to self-fund their campaigns, activity that we see is quite predominant in contemporary political elections. So one of those first rulings inkling at that relationship between freedom of speech and money spent in politics. Now we've covered this in the past, but we have to make sure we understand it clearly. What is a political action committee? We've mentioned its rise coming from Buckley v. Vallejo and the creation of super PACs due to Citizens United, but we've briefly covered them. So a political action committee is a committee representing interest groups, labor unions, corporations, or just general collectives of individuals that raise and distribute campaign funds and donations. Their focus is to advocate for policy initiatives and candidates that represent the interests of their general political action committee. You see these political action committees running predominantly off of soft money. These are funds contributed to them to then distribute how they deem fit for their overarching cause, although they, in many circumstances, not all, have regulations on how they may spend those funds. So we see just a few key points in the history of campaign finance regulations, although it's an extensive history. We didn't go into the 1907 Tillman Act, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of the 20s, the Taft-Hartley Act. There are many, many policy initiatives and Supreme Court rulings that define and regulate the extent of money spent in politics. We have seen recent rulings focusing on the sentiment evident in Buckley v. Vallejo that money spent in politics is a form of free speech and must be protected. And undue regulations on campaign finance can result in the regulation of freedom of speech, resulting in the political climate we have, revolving around electoral campaigns in which we have such extensive funding for candidates. So, briefly dive back into that Supreme Court ruling we've covered in the past, Citizens United 2010. This is a case that reached our Supreme Court because they were bringing forth, because we had a scenario where there was a nonprofit group, a political action committee, that had its constitutional legitimacy from Buckley v. Vallejo. They were aiming to air a film against Hillary Clinton's campaign. This was in 2008, was when the campaign was trying to be ran during the primary election, the one in which Hillary Clinton lost to Barack Obama. The conclusion in Citizens United was that Once they heard the case, they determined that any regulation on money and politics is equal to regulation on free speech, and that we should create what's referred to as super PACs to more adequately represent this expression of free speech for corporations and individuals, also classifying corporations as individuals that are granted this right to freedom of speech, expanding beyond simply just individuals. So what that did is it created the roadmap for super PACs. I mentioned before that the distinction between soft and hard money. Hard money has more regulations when citizens spend it on campaigns. Soft money has more regulation when the political action committee spends it on campaigns. So a super PAC is an example of soft money. This is a political action committee with unlimited contributions. So even a simple political action committee has regulations on contributions, but we expand those regulations and we diminish those regulations, for super PACs. So a super PAC cannot directly interact with campaigns, although they can obtain as many funds as they deem fit from any individual or corporation. So they cannot directly interact with those campaigns, but they can receive unlimited amounts of money from corporations, unions, groups, and other ideologically motivated individuals. Our textbook says directly, quote, the main beneficiaries of the new rules were not corporations, but ideological interest groups that were often funded by extremely wealthy individuals, end quote. Extending the influence of extremely wealthy individuals in the political process, as supported by our textbook and countless studies presented by political scientists. Simple examinations of overarching funds of previous presidential elections, we see $1.7 billion spent in the year of 2008, ballooning to $6.6 billion spent in the presidential election of 2020, and that is even during an electoral process in which we had, pandemic restrictions on the effectiveness of money spent in these politics and campaigns. We know that in recent elections, the money spent in politics has continued to increase, and that number is continuing to balloon to the point where we have it today. So, a brief discussion, because I've already spent a good amount of time on some judicial interpretations, but I wanted to single out some of these themselves. So, in our current discussion, it starts with Buckley v. Vallejo. Money equals speech under the First Amendment, and we're going to create political action committees to represent the freedom of speech of individuals and organized efforts. We will then have a 2010 ruling in Citizens United versus the FEC, in which we see, quote, the government may not suppress political speech on basis of speaker's corporate identity, end quote, providing constitutional rights to corporations, as well as solidifying that ruling provided in Buckley v. Vallejo to also entail to these corporations, as freedom of speech is freedom of money spent in politics. We see now a quick second hearing in the Supreme Court. SpeechNow.org versus the FEC is where we see supporting of the Citizens United ruling and the official creation of super PACs. I kind of tie these two rulings in together, as they were back to back and had long-lasting impacts originating from the same time period and from the same Supreme Court. We also see a later ruling in Shelby County versus Holder, a 2013 ruling, where we overturned aspects of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as jurisdictions no longer needed federal approval before changing voting laws. We saw that many dimensions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 created greater federal oversight in the state electoral process because of the extent they were restricting minorities' rights to reach the polls. And one of the main tools we did this is, for one, allowing the federal government to bring lawsuits against states. Additionally, we see that the federal government required the granting of their approval before states could change voter laws to restrict their ability to prevent many collectives or demographic groups from being able to reach the polls. This was dismantled in 2013 due to an argument focusing on the sentiment that it is no longer needing its implementation, as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was effective to the point where we needed it. We see a later Supreme Court ruling just a year later, McCutcheon versus the FEC, where they abolished aggregate contribution limits, basically total spending by one individual on all elections. So one individual does have regulations on how much they can fund, say, the campaign for Donald Trump, but if you look at every candidate there is out there, they can fund as many as they please at as much as they are legally allowed to fund each individual. So there are no overarching regulations on how much one individual can spend on an election, although there are regulations on how much one individual can spend on a candidate. We also see, which is also dismantled through some level of workarounds within super PACs and political action committees. So we also see a Rucho versus Common Clause, the most contemporary Supreme Court ruling regarding the electoral process, as we saw partisan gerrymandering being determined that it is not within the jurisdiction of the federal courts, allowing partisan gerrymandering to be an issue addressed exclusively within state court systems and within state governments. And we will cover gerrymandering later on, but it is the strategic manipulation of single-member districts to benefit one party or class. We know voting data, and we know how each household is generally predicted to cast their vote. And if you use that data to determine who is in each district, you can very strategically benefit one party, class, or collective. We saw this is one of the primary tools utilized throughout the Jim Crow era to restrict minorities from being able to reach the polls in many southeastern states. So let's dive into a couple elections. I think the 2000 election is a great election to examine, to explore the role of the Supreme Court for one, and just the impacts that a single electoral process can bring to our understanding of politics. I always like starting with a neat little detail. A trivia question. When was the first time the United States identified a connection between Republicans being the party of red and Democrats being the party of blue? Well, the answer is the 2000 election, because of how close the election was and for how long it was nationally broadcast in everybody's homes. Previously, we used orange, yellow, blue, green, whatever color to just make it clear that there was a distinction between the two candidates. But this color affiliation between these two parties will stick from this election onward due to the amount of nationally broadcast news stations frequently posting this picture that is up on this PowerPoint in the bottom right, illustrating how close the vote was, waiting for those final votes to come in and waiting for the Supreme Court ruling to determine who the winner was. So we saw the vote in this election was really just, it was brought down to the vote in the state of Florida. George Bush in his previous election, not in the previous election, George Bush in his first round of voting reportedly won the state by just 537 votes out of 6 million. That's a 0.009% lead over Al Gore. This was within a recount range. If there is a certain range, and this varies by state, of votes that a candidate wins, they will recount just to be sure that it is not a margin of error that could have occurred during the tallying process. Process that we've gotten significantly better with technology over recent years and how effective and accurate those numbers are. But we saw in 2000, there were a couple key issues here. For one, in the state of Florida, there was a unique way in which these ballots were cast, in which you had to cast your vote. Many you had to punch a hole, and there were reports that many of these hole punch ballots were not accurately being tallied, as you might have had what was referred to at the time as a hanging chad, which would be when you punched the hole and the little piece of paper that's supposed to be punched through was still hanging on. And maybe there were arguments that could have resulted in many people's vote not being counted. Well, we saw that this was an issue that was brought to the Supreme Court. This wasn't one that was determined after a recount and then they officially determined that that was the legitimate ruling. There were many issues with the recount. There were many advocacy groups campaigning to have the recounts being stopped in the state of Florida and just the simple acceptance of the Bush winner of the election. So we saw there was mass pushback at the time and contention regarding this issue, resulting in constant national broadcasts over multiple weeks. And it eventually concluded in a Supreme Court ruling, the Bush v. Gore 2000 ruling, in which there was a 5-4 majority, just a slight majority, ruling to stop the Florida recount, relying on the Equal Protection Clause, as they were arguing that the count could not be perfectly and adequately equally considered for all citizens. So when the recount was stopped and the final vote was determined, we saw that George Bush was the winner of the election. So we see, although they called it for Bush initially, and then, apologies. They did not call it for Bush initially. They called it for Gore initially. On election night, they did call for the state of Florida vote going to Al Gore. And we do see the final result being that 537 lead that was obtained by George Bush and solidified as legitimate via our Supreme Court. Their argument for why they had to advocate for the stopping of the recount, relying on the interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause, stated that a fair recount could not be met prior to the deadline due to differing standards by county. So what that would have resulted in was that a final vote would not have been obtained by January when the new president is set to take office. So they were arguing that due to the deadline being fast approaching, this was the best way to have the most equal count of the population's vote. So when we look at the role of certain institutions in the electoral process, it is worth noting the role of the media, one in which we all focus on when we talk about or when we yell about what is guiding and restricting our daily lives. So we look at the media. There's 4 general stages of media influence in the election process in the United States. We go back in time, we think about those 1790s, 1830s, the Federalist Papers. We read those papers for a reason, because that was what the population was using to interpret what our new governmental system will be, how we advocated for the Constitution or advocated against the Constitution. This was how we advocated for public support within these foundational systems that we have today. This developed over time, though, of course, as we saw the creation of those radio TV systems and the FDR fireside chats, the Lincoln Douglas debates, and we just see those. I mean, not the Lincoln Douglas debates, the Kennedy Nixon debates. As we see these debates are finally being televised and not exclusive to small collectives and whatever we can see from publications in the public press, newspapers. So the final expansion of television and radio. Television and radio sets are getting into everybody's home, and the ability for the general population to have public education regarding the electoral process is expanded significantly. 1980s, 2000s, that's where we see the shift towards cable news and the 24-hour news network that we see today. Cable news influence was significantly increasing, and we saw the first period in which we had starkly increasing nationalization of attention. We are focusing more on national politics than we're focusing on our local politics, and it is occurring consistently among the general population of the United States. Then we see the 2010 to present, and we know this era. It's the social media era, the heightened use of social media by candidates and just by interested ideological collectives. And we were probably speculation here, not something to take a note on, but we're probably entering into the AI era of media influence as we see new shifts in how social media is influencing individuals' electoral incentives, as we even have seen, I bet we've all on some, subjective anecdotal level seen those obvious AI videos that pop up after conflicts that come from every single ideology and belief. But we see that level of misinformation increasing through these networks and social media networks, which has resulted in many elected representatives advocating for certain regulations within these networks or on AI. Discussion and debate we will likely see continuing for many years to come. So let's look back at just this general arching concept of media and politics. So let's make sure we understand these key terms at the beginning. So, we understand generally the media shapes perception, influences public policy, public agendas. It is the public education function for a lot of us and really significantly influences turnout. One of the main things that is worth considering in the media and their role in elections is what is referred to as echo chambers. This has gained notable traction in the political polarization research field, as an echo chamber is understood as a reinforcing informational environment with a tendency to discredit outside sources. Simplify it. It's where the only people you talk to via media are those who agree with you. An echo chamber. It's just echoing support for sentiments and beliefs, discrediting external views, and overemphasizing the value of our individual perspectives. This, tied in with nationalization of media institutions, has provided the foundation for a lot of political scientists to argue that it is resulting in the increased focus on national news stories within echo chambers that result in greater influence and extending the rate of political polarization in the United States. So we see the media in elections, something we'll explore in a later lecture on institutions, but we see that it has a notable impact in the electoral process. And we've regulated this at times. We've seen a key piece of regulation, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission's equal time rule, which was later revoked in 1987, so it is no longer in effect. But we do see at times we've tried to regulate the way that our media institutions express their views on politics or express others' views on politics or provide platforms for candidates. And the FCC equal time rule required that when we were in that 1930s, 1960s era of public communication and media influence, it required broadcast stations to provide equal opportunities to all legally qualified political candidates for a particular political office. So simply put, if they let one candidate give a 5-minute speech, they must, by this law, offer a equal time 5-minute speech to every single person they are running against. This, as we know in recent years, it'd be very hard to have to implement this effectively, requiring that, say, Fox News cover Donald Trump and other candidates equally, or CNN do the same. It is one that has lost its effectiveness and has been revoked since 1987. Although in the last few years we have seen revisitation of this focus in one or two contexts, although speculation is that that was short-lived, to say the least, and we will likely not see enforcement of the equal time rule in contemporary politics as it was revoked in 1987. So, we talked about this briefly in the last slide. The media can directly influence voter turnout, but that is not the only thing that mobilizes voter turnout. And when we look at voter turnout, it's important to understand the story of the U.S.'s voter turnout throughout the years. So, what is voter turnout? Voter turnout is equal to the number of voters divided by the eligible voting population. So it's the voters who contributed that were eligible. You do not consider those who are under the age of 18 as they cannot vote in a voter turnout data point. So if you ever see somebody say, we had this many people vote and we have this many citizens, that's just inaccurate data, and they failed to consider some of the key variables of age, as one must. So it's important to make that distinction of eligible voting populations. We see that the data and chart we have here stems from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which provides a lot of voter turnout data points in the U.S. throughout time. We know that when we look at voter turnout in the U.S. compared to other nations, we are notably low. We rank low compared to other nations when it comes to the percentage of their population that they encourage to vote. We see some states like Sweden, Belgium, Australia, New Zealand that have up to 80-90% voter turnout, while in the United States it is much lower. We have about 50 to 60% during presidential years, and then when we have midterms, that number drops to even lower, 30-40% voter turnout. So it is, for one, relatively low compared to other democracies and relatively low compared to points in U.S. history. We look at the period in U.S. history between 1840s to 1900s, we saw up to 70 to 80% of voter turnout, of eligible voters turnout. This also did hit a low point, 1920s, 50s, as we got as low as 50-40%, even lower than what we have today. It is also worth noting, as I have mentioned many elections of the past, and how the percentage of the population voting was still relatively low. So, this is starting at roughly that 1840s, 1900s time where we had the first notable pickup of electoral turnout. As we were dismantling a lot of those barriers that were present for many, many individuals, many women, non-landowning, young, under the age of 21 males who were not of white background. So we see that impacting that time period and the dismantling of those restrictions, extensively expanding voter turnout, although we have had a ebb and flow in this rate in recent years. We did have the highest voter turnout in 120 years in the year 2020, although we have not seen those numbers being broken in recent years. We actually saw a slight decline in 2024, and we will see what happens in 2028. Also worth noting, when we look at Pew Research data, that is the most reliable demographic data in the United States, as they poll 10,000 individuals domestically every single year, we've seen that non-voters have a higher tendency to be young, uneducated, by that I mean non-college educated, and more racially diverse. those are the demographics that are least likely to vote in the United States, while those that are most likely to vote are those of old age. Also, old age are those that are most likely to be highly politically polarized. So that amendment period, the 1960s, the decade of electoral change, this is where we saw a large percentage of popular support for constitutional reform. We saw this was largely implemented in response to widespread political participation and public protest. One means in which, history tells us that mass protest is effective, because the period in which we had some of the most notable public protests in the 1960s, we see those famous photos of people in these protests that may have gone wrong, but we do see the impact of that protest, the impact of that public mass participation resulted in 4 amendments that directly represent the people's interests in the electoral process. 23rd, we're granting DC electors in the Electoral College. Not only will we have DC be the capital of our nation, but we're going to give them electoral rights, give their citizens electoral power in the presidential election. 24th Amendment, we're going to abolish poll taxes, get rid of these barriers preventing us from being able to cast our votes. 25th Amendment, we're going to establish procedures for presidential succession. We were worried. We saw, we remember the assassination of JFK, resulting in mass fears and concerns about what is the presidential line of succession. What we have presented in the past stems from our 25th Amendment, as it was simply relied on by norms and precedent prior. 26th Amendment, we lowered that voting age. If you're going to send us to war, you better give us the right to vote. We lowered that voting age from 21 to 18 in response to mass protests, predominantly revolving around the Vietnam War. So we see the activities of citizens directly resulting in change within our government. Not just change, not just laws, but the hardest change to make in the U.S. government, amending our Constitution, doing more so in this decade than we have in any other after the Bill of Rights ratification. So let's go back in time a little bit, and an election that incentivized the implementation of the 22nd Amendment. When FDR won his 3rd and 4th elections for president, as he was the president from 1933 to 1945. If you remember a little history, you remember that's the era spanning from the Great Depression to World War II. So oftentimes, we see in this scenario relying on emergency powers, although not officially declared, but the emergency powers sentiment to continue his campaign for presidency, breaking that precedent established by George Washington in the past. We do see that in his 4th term. He did die in his first year of that 4th term. That would result in his vice president, according to the 22nd Amendment, taking power and holding their first full term as president. They would only be able to run for a single re-election, as that would count as their first term. So this revealed the need for the 22nd Amendment that was implemented by the next decade in 1951. It was proposed with mass bipartisan support, and it implemented as a protective measure against authoritarianism, unstable transitions of power, and just general concentrations of power and influence. This was also not just due to FDR's winning of 4 presidential elections, but the extensive expansion of the bureaucracy in the United States and the role of the federal government. So we know that these elections had significant influence in incentivizing the need for electoral reform, a theme we're seeing repeated throughout today's lecture, either the incentivizations through previous elections or the example of a previous amendment being implemented in other elections, like when we look at that 1824 election. So, 22nd Amendment, 1951, it was ratified in its response to FDR's winning 4 presidential elections and the significant expansion of the bureaucracy under his leadership. And we see, in addition, increasing concerns regarding concentration of power. This was done in response to increasing concerns, concentration of power as authoritarianism and lack of stability. Our 22nd Amendment says, quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term which some other person was elected shall be elected to the office of the president more than once." End quote. I might have missed a word or two because my picture is in the way. But we see this 22nd Amendment specifying how we will determine term limits regarding the presidency. The Electoral College. How do we even determine how we make up the Electoral College? For one, it's very important. Simple math. House plus Senate plus DC's 3, and you got the number we have today. So what does the Electoral College even originate from? It originates as a compromise made by our founding fathers, a key theme of this entire course, as some wanted the president appointed by the Senate, while others wanted the president to be determined through a popular vote of qualified citizens. So we see that compromise during those constitutional conventions created this system we have. What was at the time referred to as electors, not the Electoral College, although it is expanded through use to be the Electoral College in contemporary days. So we even see the 12th Amendment is the first time the Constitution addresses the term electors directly as it calls them the electors of the Electoral College, and it determines how those votes will be distributed, creating the system we have today, and how we will determine who the winner is if those votes do not get distributed adequately. We also see if we do look at changing the Electoral College, this is a key point to make, we would have to do so via a constitutional amendment. Why? Because it's a part of our Constitution via a previous amendment. So we will we'll explore later on when we talk about how systems are changed within the United States on the role of the amendment process. But we even know in U.S. history there was an amendment proposed in the 1970s that was calling for the abolition of the Electoral College with 80% public polling support that did eventually fail due to a successful filibuster and has not been revisited in recent years. So we see the Electoral College originating from a compromise due the number we need, the number making up the Electoral College, identified through simple math, House plus Senate plus DC, there are 3. And we know that a lot of these processes are guided through our 12th Amendment that directly calls for the electors to distribute their votes accordingly. Here are those what do we learn slides. Learn your things, answer the questions. Email me if you have any questions about these questions. Here are your answers. What is due this week? Make sure you have your ideal election assignment turned in. Make sure you go through those readings, those discussions. Make sure you've turned in everything that has been due so far in this course. If you have any questions about the course, reach out to me. We're reaching that midway point, so your grade matters. They're starting to really get an indication of what direction you're heading in this course, and it's very important to do every little bit to make sure that you keep that grade up. Keep contributing to those discussions, keep going through the readings, and keep completing your assignments. So keep your eyes out in those modules tabs for any other future assignments.